The trembling hand that placed cyanide capsules into the mouths of sleeping children belonged to a woman who had once hosted champagne receptions for foreign ambassadors. May 1st, 1945, beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, Magda Goebbels moved through the bunker's concrete corridors, distributing jewelry to secretaries, smoothing the hair of her 6 youngest children one final time, writing short notes in precise script that would later be catalogued by Allied intelligence officers. The air in the bunker smelled of diesel fuel, damp concrete, and the faint sweetness of the morphine she had used to sedate Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Haida before the poison. Above ground, Soviet artillery thundered closer with each passing hour. This moment marked not just the end of a regime, but the beginning of a reckoning for the women who had stood beside its architects. Late on April 29, 1945, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony inside the Führer bunker. She had waited 16 years for this recognition, hiding in mountain retreats and Bavarian estates, while Hitler maintained the fiction of celibacy for propaganda purposes. The marriage lasted approximately 40 hours. Both died on April 30th as Soviet troops advanced through the Chancellery district, Hitler by gunshot, Braun almost certainly by cyanide capsule, the same compound that would kill the Goebbels children the following day. Their bodies were carried up concrete stairs, doused with petrol, and burned in a shell crater while machine gun fire echoed through nearby streets. Before you hear what happened next, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if this story grips you, hit that like button and subscribe. History this raw deserves to be remembered. The discovery came in stages. Soviet troops entering the bunker complex on May 2nd found charred remains, abandoned uniforms, and the systematic documentation of a regime that had kept meticulous records until its final hours. In one room, they found Eva Braun's personal photographs scattered across a desk, images of alpine picnics and Berchtesgaden tea parties that would later be seized by American intelligence and used to reconstruct the domestic life of Hitler's inner circle. Her diary fragments from February through May 1935, written in careful longhand, provided primary source windows into a world that official propaganda had never shown. A young woman waiting for phone calls, arranging flowers, watching films, living in the shadow of a man who would bring continents to war. By May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The city that had once been the Reich's beating heart lay in ruins. Roughly 600,000 apartments in Berlin had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Only about 2.8 million residents remained of the pre-war 4.3 million. The rest had fled, died in bombing raids, or perished in the final savage street fighting that turned neighborhoods into killing grounds. The air smelled of burning wood, tar, and raw sewage, where broken pipes leaked into basements. Photographers who entered the city in those first days described a stillness of death, broken only by the distant crash of collapsing buildings and the constant metallic clang of Soviet search parties moving through rubble. The wives who survived that first week faced a transformed world. Emmy Göring, who had entertained foreign dignitaries in gilded reception rooms at Hall, watched as Soviet soldiers requisitioned her husband's art collection and began cataloguing property for confiscation. Winifred Wagner, Bayreuth's hostess and Hitler's devoted friend, saw American troops arrive at her villa with interpreters and document boxes, ready to rifle through decades of correspondence. Ilse Hess, whose husband Rudolf had flown to Scotland in 1941 on his bizarre solo peace mission, braced for interrogation about a marriage that had become a geopolitical oddity. The house-to-house searches began immediately. Allied intelligence teams, soldiers, interpreters, and occupation specialists moved through villas and apartments with flashlights and document cases. They opened desk drawers, pried up floorboards, examined photograph albums, confiscated diaries. Private papers that chronicled salon evenings and birthday parties became evidence files. Personal photographs showing casual gatherings at Berchtesgaden or Bayreuth were marked, dated, and shipped to intelligence centers for analysis. Women who had once posed in elegant gowns beside their uniformed husbands now watched strangers handle their most intimate possessions, annotating margins, circling names, building cases. An Allied journalist entering one former First Lady salon in mid-May wrote of finding rooms full of dust, cigarette butts, and the faint, sweet, bitter smell of perfume lingering like an accusation. The scent was real. In those abandoned spaces, luxury had calcified into artifact. Silk curtains hung torn from their rods. Crystal chandeliers dangled at angles where shockwaves had loosened their moorings. Marble floors bore boot prints in plaster dust. The texture of power had been expensive fabrics, polished surfaces, controlled lighting. Now it was debris, violation, evidence. Many women attempted to erase visible traces before the searches reached them. Party badges disappeared into sewers, letters were burned in kitchen stoves, some changed surnames, claiming estrangement or using maiden names. Others kept souvenirs hidden in trunks or buried in gardens, preserving memory and potential bargaining chips for an uncertain future. The calculus was immediate. What would condemn? What might protect? What could be traded? The legal architecture that would govern their fates was already taking shape. Denazification created categories that would determine everything from housing rights to employment prospects, major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated persons. Allied authorities circulated blacklists that restricted travel, froze bank accounts, and barred holders from public office. Many prominent Nazi wives found their names on these lists within weeks: Emmy Göring, Winifred Wagner, Ilse Hess, the wives of dead leaders and imprisoned officials. Women whose crimes were association, whose punishment would be administered through bureaucracy and social ostracism rather than tribunals. But what sins could be pinned on women who had merely hosted parties? The question would echo through hundreds of interrogation rooms in the coming months, in cold detention facilities across occupied Germany. Women who had once commanded servants and planned state dinners now sat across wooden tables from Allied officers with stenographers recording every word. The transcripts reveal a pattern: denial, loyalty, strategic amnesia. I was only a housewife. I never discussed politics. My husband kept those matters from me. The legal defense was domestic retreat, the claim that kitchen and nursery had insulated them from the regime's machinery. The truth was more complex, and everyone knew it. The bread line stretched 43 women deep outside the municipal distribution center in what had once been Berlin's fashionable Charlottenburg district. Third from the back, wearing a patched wool coat that had been cut down from a ball gown, stood a woman whose hands still bore the calluses from scrubbing floors in her own former ballroom. June 1945, 7 weeks after the surrender, and the texture of survival had become queuing in the morning cold for 400 grams of dark bread and a paper twist of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. The distance between champagne and chicory was measured in weeks, not years. Allied occupation food policies had left German civilians in the western zones subsisting on as little as 1,200 calories per day, roughly 5,000 kilojoules, a starvation ration that Allied authorities publicly contrasted with the 2,300 calories supplied to displaced person populations in the camps. The message was deliberate: the defeated would eat last and least. For women who had once supervised kitchen staff preparing 7-course dinners, the mathematics of hunger became intimate: how to stretch a week's ration of potatoes across 9 days, whether to trade a hidden silver fork for 2 tins of American condensed milk, which child ate first when there wasn't enough. Emmy Göring discovered the new arithmetic when she attempted to access her family's bank accounts in late May. The officer reviewing her case in the American zone looked up from his ledger and informed her that assets belonging to high-ranking Nazi officials had been frozen pending investigation. Personal property would be catalogued. Items classified as party property would be confiscated. The Karin Hall art collection, the furniture, the automobiles, the jewelry, everything Hermann Göring had accumulated through corruption, theft, and state largesse was now evidence. She had been one of the Reich's wealthiest women. Overnight, she couldn't withdraw enough Reichsmarks to buy bread on the black market. The currency itself had become worthless paper. Reichsmarks that had bought luxury goods in 1944 wouldn't purchase a kilogram of flour in 1945. The real economy ran on barter and black market exchange rates calculated in cigarettes, chocolate, and canned goods. American Lucky Strikes became currency. British tinned beef became wealth. Women who had never touched their own laundry learned to trade handmade clothing for coal, preserved fruit for medicine, family silver for meat. The markets operated in rubble-strewn squares and basement stairwells, whispered transactions where a porcelain figurine might buy 3 days of butter. Transportation networks had collapsed along with everything else. Train lines that had carried luxury passengers from Berlin to Munich in 8 hours now took 3 days when they ran at all. Tracks had been bombed, bridges destroyed, rolling stock requisitioned by occupation armies. Women attempting to reach relatives in other zones discovered that journeys requiring hours in 1938 now demanded days of waiting on platforms, sleeping in station waiting rooms, bribing conductors for space in overcrowded freight cars. The once grand Mercedes and staff cars that had ferried officials between ministries were either requisitioned by Allied armies or stripped for parts in makeshift chop shops. The machinery of elite mobility had been dismantled piece by piece. The detention facilities where suspected collaborators and their families awaited tribunal hearings were cold, crowded, and aggressively bureaucratic. Ilse Hess spent weeks in one such facility near Munich, sleeping on a straw mattress in a room shared with 7 other women, waiting while Allied authorities sorted through files and interrogated witnesses about her husband's peculiar flight to Scotland. The rooms smelled of unwashed bodies, coal smoke, and institutional disinfectant. Guards delivered meals on tin plates, boiled potatoes, thin soup, occasional portions of greyish meat. The women waited for their names to be called, for interrogation sessions that might last hours, for legal determinations that would decide whether they were major offenders, followers, or something in between. Emmy Göring attempted to leverage her remaining social connections to protect her husband's legacy and secure her own position. She wrote letters to former acquaintances in neutral countries. She granted interviews to occupation officials, carefully framing Hermann as a military professional rather than an ideological fanatic. She emphasized her own distance from party politics, her focus on cultural patronage and social duties. The strategy failed. Hermann Göring would be tried at Nuremberg as one of the regime's principal architects. His art collection would be revealed as a trove of stolen treasures looted from Jewish families and occupied territories. Emmy's protestations of innocence rang hollow in rooms where prosecutors had documentation of every acquisition, every banquet, every decision. The built environment told its own story of collapse. Women who had lived in villas with marble staircases and vaulted propaganda rooms now found themselves relocated to single rooms in overcrowded apartments, sharing coal-fired stoves with strangers. The contrast was architectural violence, from salon furniture and electric chandeliers to straw mattresses and single-burner kerosene stoves. Flooded basements, shattered windows, and destroyed plumbing meant households warmed themselves by small braziers, cooked on improvised burners, and wore the smell of soot and kerosene like a second skin. Hands went perpetually gray. Clothes absorbed smoke. The sensory signature of defeat was coal dust and chemical fuel. Power grids across German cities remained destroyed through the summer and fall. Refrigerators stood useless. Electric cookers became metal sculptures. Radios went silent, except when military generators provided brief windows of power. Women learned to preserve food in cool cellars or smoke meat using methods their grandmothers had known. Household technologies that had marked modernity became reminders of what had been lost. A dead refrigerator in a kitchen without electricity was a monument to collapsed infrastructure. The public shaming began almost immediately. In neighborhoods where Nazi wives were known, neighbors marked their windows or refused small courtesies. A woman who had hosted party gatherings found herself unable to borrow sugar. Another discovered that former friends crossed the street rather than acknowledge her. The social penalties cut deeper than legal sanctions because they were personal, intimate, impossible to appeal. Children whispered accusations. Shopkeepers found excuses not to sell. The invisible network of daily cooperation that sustained life in devastated cities simply vanished for women whose names appeared on the blacklists. Winifred Wagner faced her own version of ostracism. Bayreuth's hostess and Hitler's devoted friend retained some influence in local cultural circles, but international music communities closed their doors. The Bayreuth Festival, which had become synonymous with Nazi cultural propaganda during the regime, was suspended. Wagner's own attempts to restart it met resistance from occupation authorities who understood the festival's symbolic weight. She would spend years attempting to separate Richard Wagner's art from Adolf Hitler's appropriation of it, a distinction that satisfied no one. Some women tried to flee. Emigration to Argentina, Spain, or other South American countries became a whispered possibility for those with ready contacts and hidden funds. But Allied bureaucratic controls made passports nearly impossible to secure. Travel documents required clearance from denazification tribunals. Exit visas demanded proof of non-complicity. Bank transfers were monitored. The few who managed to leave were those who had prepared early, who had moved money through neutral countries before the collapse, who had contacts willing to risk harboring refugees from the Reich. Most had nowhere to go. The winter of 1945-46 approached with the promise of bitter cold and fuel shortages that would kill thousands. Blankets became treasured possessions. Felt slippers and layered clothing turned former ballrooms into survival shelters. The weather magnified every misery, melted snow turning streets into slushy mud, frozen pipes bursting in abandoned buildings, winds howling through shattered windows that couldn't be repaired for lack of glass. Women who had worn silk gowns learned to lay a newspaper under wool coats for insulation. Yet even in the ruins, hierarchies persisted. Living conditions varied sharply by occupation zone. The Soviet zone requisitioned houses for officials and crowded German families into smaller spaces. The Western zones allowed slightly more autonomy, but maintained strict rationing. The British sector had better coal distribution. The American sector had better food access. Women learned these distinctions quickly and traded information about which zones offered better survival prospects, which borders could be crossed, which officials might be bribed with family heirlooms. But survival raised its own question. Survival for what purpose? The women who had stood beside the Reich's architects now faced decades of reckoning with what they had enabled, what they had ignored, what they had known. The interrogation rooms and detention facilities were only the beginning. The real punishment would be living with memory in a world that would never let them forget. The stenographer's fingers moved across the keys with mechanical precision, recording words that would determine whether the woman across the table would be classified as a major offender or merely a follower. November 1945, a drafty requisitioned office in Stuttgart, and the woman being questioned, wife of a Gauleiter who had administered forced labor programs, sat with her hands folded in her lap, reciting the script she had rehearsed for weeks. I never discussed politics with my husband. My role was purely domestic. I raised our children and managed our household. I knew nothing of his work. The lie was careful, rehearsed, and utterly transparent. Denazification tribunals were processing tens of thousands of cases across occupied Germany, attempting to sort the guilty from the complicit from the merely adjacent. The system created 5 legal categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. Where a woman landed on this spectrum determined everything: whether she could work, inherit property, travel, own a business, send her children to certain schools. The stakes were measured in decades, not months. A classification as major offender meant internment, heavy fines, permanent employment bans. Follower status might mean a small fine and restricted rights for a few years. Exonerated meant escape. The most common legal strategy was the domestic defense. Allied psychological intelligence units recorded hundreds of interrogations in which Nazi wives attempted to draw bright lines between their husbands' political activities and their own household responsibilities. The transcripts reveal a pattern of strategic amnesia, carefully calibrated ignorance, and claims of powerlessness. He never brought his work home. I hosted dinners but never listened to the conversations. How could I have known what was happening in the camps? The assertions required interviewers to believe that women who had managed households with dozens of staff, who had planned state functions for hundreds of guests, who had corresponded with other regime wives about rationing and evacuation plans, had somehow remained sealed inside a domestic bubble impermeable to the regime's machinery. Some tribunals accepted these claims, others did not. The difference often came down to documentation, whether letters survived, whether servants testified, whether neighbors remembered conversations. Hundreds of thousands of German women applied for denazification safeguards in the first 2 post-war years. Testimonial letters from Jewish acquaintances they had helped, character witnesses who would vouch for their non-participation, evidence of resistance activities that existed only in selective memory. The bureaucratic scramble to secure favorable classifications became its own industry, with lawyers, fixers, and former colleagues trading testimonials like black market cigarettes. The women who had stood closest to power faced specialized scrutiny. Emmy Göring's interrogations focused not just on what she had known about her husband's art looting, but on her own role in acquiring and displaying stolen property. Had she questioned the provenance of paintings that appeared overnight in Hall? Had she noticed when Jewish families' collections were catalogued and transported? The interrogators had documentation, acquisition lists, correspondence, photographs showing Emmy posed beside artworks that bore inventory stamps from occupied France and Poland. Her claims of ignorance collapsed under paper evidence. Magda Goebbels had escaped this reckoning through suicide, but her final hours became subjects of investigation nonetheless. Allied intelligence officers interviewed bunker survivors, reconstructed her movements on May 1st, documented the morphine and cyanide administration, analyzed her final notes. Joseph Goebbels' diary habit, he had kept daily entries and had them microfilmed in 1944 and 45, provided contemporaneous records of the family's final days. The diaries revealed a woman who had been fully complicit in her husband's propaganda ministry, who had attended rallies and shaped public messaging about German motherhood, who had understood exactly what the regime represented. Her decision to murder her children, rather than allow them to live in a post-Nazi world, was the final terrible confirmation of her ideological commitment. But what about the women who had remained silent rather than complicit? The The question haunted tribunals, attempting to distinguish between active participation and passive enabling. Some wives had genuinely remained distant from their husband's work. Others had cultivated deliberate ignorance, choosing not to ask questions whose answers they didn't want to know. Still others had known everything and simply said nothing, a silence that now looked like consent. The legal system struggled to categorize gradations of complicity when the entire society had been structured around participation and silence. Religious institutions became refugees for some, and sources of condemnation for others. Certain wives returned to church seeking absolution, confessing sins to priests who had themselves remained silent during the Reich's crimes. Others clung to nationalist myths, reading clandestine pamphlets that blamed Bolsheviks and traitors rather than accepting responsibility for the regime's collapse. In basement gatherings and private apartments, small groups of unrepentant believers exchanged conspiracy theories and false hope, convinced that Allied occupation was temporary, that the real Germany would rise again, that history would vindicate their choices. Meanwhile, daily survival demanded improvisation that had nothing to do with ideology. Former housekeepers and servants who had once managed estates turned to the black market with practiced efficiency. Women bartered homemade clothing for coal, eggs for medicine, preserved fruit for meat in makeshift bazaars that operated in bombed-out buildings and railway underpasses. The patron-client networks that had sustained elite households during the Reich adapted to post-collapse conditions. A former chauffeur arranged food quotas in exchange for help with his denazification hearing. An ex-official neighbor provided tribunal testimony in return for access to hidden fuel stores. Intimate relationships of dependence and obligation persisted, even as public power structures evaporated. The texture of daily life had coarsened beyond recognition. Luxurious fabrics gave way to coarse wool and patched seams. Former gowns were cut down into children's clothes, their silk linings repurposed as barter goods. Felt hats were reblocked and reshaped year after year. Leather shoes were resoled with tire rubber, the visible markers of status, clothing. Quality, jewelry, grooming dissolved into universal shabbiness. Everyone looked poor because everyone was poor, except for those connected to occupation authorities or black market supply chains. Hospitals and clinics remained overwhelmed throughout 1946. Women with small children or chronic illnesses relied on improvised midwives and herbal remedies when pharmacies ran out of basic medicines. Infant mortality spiked. Diseases that had been controlled before the war, tuberculosis, diphtheria, typhoid, returned to devastated cities where sanitation systems had collapsed. Former elite wives who had once summoned private physicians now waited in clinic lines beside factory workers and refugees, all equally reduced by the democracy of catastrophe. The soundscape of their lives had transformed utterly. Once-filled ballrooms went silent. Air raid sirens became memory. The new soundtrack was the tramp of occupation troops, typewriters cataloging evidence in requisitioned offices, Allied trucks grinding through streets too damaged for civilian traffic. The metallic clang of reconstruction work, hammering, welding, demolition, replaced the orchestrated sounds of state ceremonies and propaganda broadcasts. Even silence sounded different in the ruins, denser, more complete, broken by unexpected crashes as weakened buildings finally surrendered to gravity. Some women began publishing accounts or granting interviews, attempting to shape post-war memory before official narratives hardened into history. These memoirs and testimonies became invaluable primary sources. But historians learned to read them for self-justification and selective amnesia as much as factual accuracy. The pattern was consistent: emphasis on personal suffering, minimization of complicity, strategic forgetting about specific events and dates. I don't recall. That must have been someone else. I was never present for those discussions. The construction of innocent memory became its own project, yet reality kept intruding. Documents survived, photographs existed, witnesses remembered. No matter how carefully the stories were constructed, the material record contradicted them. A letter mentioning a reception for Heinrich Himmler, a photograph showing smiling attendants at a rally, a requisition form bearing a familiar signature. The past refused to stay buried in the gardens where party badges had been hidden, and in the growing distance between claimed innocence and documented participation, a question crystallized. How many had truly been ignorant, and how many had simply chosen not to see? By 1949, the woman who answered the door of a modest pension house in rural Bavaria introduced herself as Frau Schmidt, though the neighbor children whispered that her real name was something else, something that appeared on old newspapers their parents kept hidden in attics. She served breakfast to traveling salesmen and hikers without comment, collected modest fees in the new Deutsche Marks, and kept a single photograph in her bedroom drawer, a faded image of herself in an evening gown, standing beside a man in uniform whose face she had carefully scratched away with a penknife. The transformation from power to obscurity had taken less than 5 years. The late 1940s brought a quiet reinsertion of former Nazi wives into provincial German society, a process that unfolded through careful obscurity rather than rehabilitation. Some women ran pension houses in small towns where strangers didn't ask questions about the past. Others opened small shops selling notions and household goods, operating on thin margins and state pensions barely adequate for survival. A few found work as translators or clerks, their education and language skills valuable in an occupation economy desperate for administrative competence. They kept their heads down, used abbreviated surnames, and learned the social choreography of forgetting. The legal reckoning had produced uneven results. Of the high-profile Nazi wives, Emmy Göring had been tried and sentenced to imprisonment, though she was released in 1946 and lived quietly until her death in 1973. Winifred Wagner remained in Bayreuth, gradually marginalized but never fully ostracized from the cultural circles she had once dominated. The festival eventually restarted under her son's management, though she was barred from official roles. Ilse Hess lived under a cloud of association with her imprisoned husband's bizarre legacy, corresponding with Rudolf in Spandau prison through heavily censored letters for decades. She never remarried, never reclaimed prominence, and died in 1995, having spent half a century as a footnote to her husband's inexplicable flight. The women who survived lived out their days in relative obscurity, their former status reduced to battered photographs and whispered memories. In provincial apartments and rural cottages, they kept trunks containing the material residue of their former lives, theater programs from state functions, invitation cards embossed with eagles and swastikas, silver spoons that had escaped confiscation. These artifacts remained hidden, shown to no one, treasured for reasons their owners could barely articulate, evidence of a world that seemed increasingly unreal as the Federal Republic emerged from occupation. The economic miracle of the 1950s transformed West Germany with a speed that felt surreal to women who had lived through the starvation years. Streets rebuilt, new apartments constructed, employment opportunities expanded, the Deutsche Mark gained value, shops filled with goods. Within a decade, German cities that had been rubble fields looked modern and prosperous. But the transformation brought its own alienation. The wives who had represented the Reich's elite found themselves bypassed by the new prosperity, too old for the emerging labor market, too compromised for professional rehabilitation, too poor to benefit from the rising tide. Some attempted to secure compensation or restitution of property confiscated during denazification. These legal battles produced mixed results. Properties classified as personal assets were sometimes returned. Items classified as party property or stolen goods remained confiscated. Bank accounts were partially unfrozen after documentation review. The bureaucracy was exhausting, expensive, and often unsuccessful. Women spent years pursuing claims that yielded only fractions of what had been taken, if anything at all. Cultural dislocation persisted. The opera houses reopened, but the audiences were different. International correspondents returned, but the social circles had shifted. Radio broadcasts featured American jazz and British commentary rather than martial anthems. The cultural life that had been carefully curated by the Reich gave way to occupation tastes, then to a democratic marketplace of ideas. Women who had once hosted salons for poets and composers found themselves listening to forbidden music on reconditioned radios, recognizing that the culture they had championed had been not just defeated but discredited. The children of Nazi wives carried their own burdens. Grown children of prominent officials faced questions at university, in job interviews, in social situations. What did your father do during the war? The question hung over lives, forcing decisions about whether to defend, distance, or simply refuse to discuss. Some changed their surnames, others emigrated, a few became historians or activists, attempting to understand or atone for their parents' choices. The inheritance was shame, curiosity, and complicated grief. By the 1960s and 70s, a handful of Nazi wives granted interviews to historians attempting to document the inner workings of the regime. These conversations, recorded on tape and preserved in archives, revealed women still struggling with memory and meaning. Some expressed regret, carefully calibrated, focused on outcomes rather than choices. Others maintained defiance, insisting they had done nothing wrong, that they had simply been wives and mothers caught in historical forces beyond their control. A few offered genuine reflection, acknowledging complicity and grappling with what it meant to have lived comfortably while others suffered. The most honest among them admitted what the domestic defense had always concealed. They had known, perhaps not every detail, not every mechanism of the camps and killing centers, But the broad strokes, the arrests, the deportations, the disappearances, the smell of smoke from camps that sat too close to towns, the household staff who appeared suddenly after Jewish families emigrated, the paintings and furniture that arrived with suspicious provenance. They had known enough to understand that the regime they supported was built on violence, and they had chosen comfort over confrontation. What would you have done, knowing that questions meant danger for your family? The question had no comfortable answer, which is perhaps why so many had chosen not to ask it in the first place. The Nazi wives who survived into old age carried this knowledge into their final decades, that they had been offered choices, however constrained, and that their choices had consequences. Some made peace with this, others never did. They died in provincial obscurity, their obituaries brief when they appeared at all, their funerals attended by aging neighbors who remembered them only as quiet pensioners. The material traces they left behind became historical artifacts. Eva Braun's photographs, seized by American intelligence, now reside in archives where researchers examine them for insights into the regime's domestic life. Magda Goebbels' final notes, recorded in interrogation transcripts, are studied for what they reveal about ideological commitment carried to its ultimate conclusion. Emmy Göring's letters from detention appear in historical collections. Ilse Hesse's decades of correspondence with Spandau prison formed a peculiar archive of unshakable loyalty to a husband who had destroyed his own life on a gambit that failed before it began. The lesson encoded in these lives is uncomfortable. Proximity to power doesn't require active evil, only passive acceptance. The Nazi wives who didn't pull triggers or issue orders nonetheless enabled the machinery through their silence, their comfort, their willingness to enjoy luxury built on exploitation. When the regime collapsed, they discovered that complicity had its own reckoning, slower than justice, more grinding than punishment, a lifetime of diminishment and obscurity that replaced the champagne and chandeliers with ersatz coffee and scratched-out photographs. In the end, most of them lived long enough to see Germany become something they hadn't imagined possible: democratic, prosperous, genuinely free. They watched from the margins as the Federal Republic emerged from occupation, joined international institutions, and built a society deliberately opposed to everything the Reich had represented. They witnessed the success of the very system they had once dismissed as weak and decadent. They had been wrong about everything that mattered. The women of the Reich rebuilt their lives amid shame and punishment, but what they built was small, private, and ultimately forgotten by a nation desperate to move forward. Their grand story ended not with dramatic trials or public executions, but with obscurity, pensioner status, and battered photographs kept in drawers that no one opened after they died. The distance between power and irrelevance was measured in years, but it was absolute.